There is a scene in the first episode of My Hero Academia where a 4-year-old boy sits on the floor of his bedroom, knees pulled to his chest, watching a hero save hundreds of people on a tiny television screen. His face is wet, his fists are shaking, and even at 4 years old, he already knows exactly what he wants to be. That image worked on millions of people. It still works. There is something about it that feels true in a way that goes past anime, past shonen, past the genre entirely. The kid with nothing, who refuses to accept that nothing is all he gets. But here is what nobody talks about. My Hero Academia built one of the richest, most emotionally complex worlds in modern anime history. It populated that world with some of the most fascinating characters the genre has ever produced. And then it centered all of it on the wrong person. Welcome to Animind. This is why Deku was a mistake. The broken promise. How? Chapter 1 betrayed its own premise. Picture the first page of a manga that would go on to sell over 100 million copies. A boy with messy green hair sits in front of a television screen, eyes wide, watching a hero rescue dozens of people from a collapsing building. His fists are clenched, his cheeks are wet, and even at 4 years old, this boy already knows exactly what he wants to be. The shot is simple, the feeling is enormous, and the promise the story is making to you in that moment is one of the most exciting promises a shonen manga has ever made. That promise goes like this. In a world where 80% of people are born with superpowers, one boy has nothing. No power, no special ability, not even a hint of one. Just a brain that never stops studying, a heart that runs too big for his chest, and a dream that every adult in his life has told him is impossible. He is going to become a hero anyway. Not because someone hands him the tools, not because the universe decides to be kind, but because he is going to figure it out, piece by piece, scar by scar, in a world that was never built for him. That is the story My Hero Academia tells you it is on page 1. It stops telling you that story on roughly page 50, because what actually happens is this. A boy named Izuku Midoriya, known as Deku, runs into his idol by accident at a train station. His idol is All Might, the greatest hero alive, the most powerful person on the planet, the man whose posters cover Deku's bedroom walls. And All Might, after a single conversation and a single moment of watching Deku act selflessly without thinking, makes a decision. He passes his power, one for all, the strongest quirk in existence, a stockpiled mass of raw, superhuman strength built up across 8 generations, directly into Deku's hands. Not because Deku earned it over years of grinding, not because Deku found a clever way around the system, because All Might liked what he saw in about 45 minutes. And just like that, the boy with nothing has the most powerful something in the world. The story of the underdog who beats the system without powers never happened. It was replaced almost immediately with a different story, a more comfortable one, a more familiar one, about a boy who gets the best possible quirk and then learns to use it properly. That is a fine story. Plenty of great shonen manga tell that story, but it is not the story My Hero Academia opened with. And that gap between the story the first chapter promised and the story the series actually told is where almost every problem with Deku as a protagonist begins. Here is the part that makes this genuinely strange. It was not always going to go this way. Kohei Horikoshi, the man who wrote and drew every page of My Hero Academia, originally planned to keep Deku quirkless. Not for a little while, for the whole story. The idea was exactly what the first chapter sets up. A boy who finds ways to be a hero through intelligence, preparation, and will, rather than through raw power. Think of it like Batman in a world full of Supermans. The underdog appeal was supposed to be real, not just a brief emotional setup before the power arrives. His editor said no. The concern was commercial. A protagonist who stays powerless in a world of superpowers is a harder sell to a weekly manga audience. You need the hero to be able to compete in the fights. You need escalation. The market logic is not wrong, exactly. But what was lost in that editorial decision is enormous, because the version of this story that could have existed, the one where Deku actually proves the system wrong from within it, using nothing it gave him, was never told. Instead, the published version tells you the system was wrong while simultaneously confirming it. You cannot be a hero without power. Here, have power. What makes this worse is how good the premise actually was. The world Horikoshi built is one where having a superpower is so normal that not having one is considered a medical condition. Children go to doctors at age 4 to find out if their quirk has come in. Kids who test quirkless are handed pamphlets. Adults speak carefully around them. Izuku's own mother, on the day they find out he has nothing, holds him and cries and says she is sorry. She apologizes to her son for the body he was born in. That is devastating. That is a real thing that parents do to children with differences. They apologize because the world has told them it is something to be sorry for. A story built on that foundation, one where the protagonist never gets the power but finds his way anyway, would have been about something real and urgent. It would have been about what it costs to exist in a world that keeps keeps telling you your natural state is not enough, and how you find your worth anyway. Deku staying quirkless and becoming a hero regardless would have been, as multiple critics and fans have pointed out, one of the most genuinely inspiring things a shonen manga could do. Instead, the story confirms the prejudice it sets up. Deku needs a quirk to succeed. The story makes that choice in Chapter 3, and then spends 430 chapters gently circling around the implications of having made it. Because here is the unavoidable truth. If Deku truly could have done what the first chapter suggested, the rest of the story did not need to happen the way it did. The broken bones, the years of slowly learning to use a power his body was never designed for, the constant self-destruction. All of that is the cost of receiving something he was never built to carry, and it would have been unnecessary if the story had committed to its actual opening premise. A quirkless Deku working smart instead of working with borrowed strength would not have spent 3 seasons shattering his own arms in pursuit of a power that was never supposed to be his. There is also a deeper problem buried in how One for All actually works. When All Might was at his peak, One for All gave him strength so massive he could change weather with a single punch. By the time Deku inherits it, the quirk has been handed down through 8 previous users, and each of those users left a piece of themselves behind, including smaller, individual quirks that Deku eventually learns to access and use on top of the base power boost. So Deku does not just get the most powerful quirk in the series. He gets the most powerful quirk in the series, plus 6 additional abilities layered on top, including the ability to produce whip-like tendrils of dark energy, the ability to float, the ability to release explosive shockwaves, and more. By the later arcs, Deku is not an underdog in any meaningful sense. He is a Swiss Army knife of superpowers with a guilt complex, and the story never fully reckons with what that means for the premise that launched it. The emotional core of those early chapters works because you believe Deku is actually climbing from nothing. The first time he uses One for All and shatters his hand using it, the pain feels like the price of the journey. But reread those early chapters knowing what comes later, knowing that Deku will eventually be using 6 different quirks simultaneously at near maximum output, and the underdog framing starts to feel less like genuine struggle and more like a training arc before the real power kicks in. The sacrifice of broken bones reads differently once you know the destination. Now here is the cruelest irony of everything. After all of it, the borrowed power, the broken arms, the years of learning to use something his body was not built for, the whole long, complicated journey of becoming the most powerful hero in Japan, Deku ends the story quirkless. He gives up One for All in the final battle. He transfers it piece by piece into Tamura Shigaraki to fight from within the villain's mind. When the war ends and the dust settles, the ember of power left inside him fades over the following 8 years. He becomes a teacher at UA. He is quirkless again. The story took him from quirkless, spent 430 chapters on the journey, and brought him back to quirkless. He went around the entire circle and landed on the same tile he started on. That ending could mean something powerful. Some readers have argued it does, that Deku returning to his original state while still being a working hero proves the point the series was always trying to make. But there is a problem with that reading. If the story wanted to prove that a quirkless person can be a hero, the time to prove it was during the story, not after, not as a result of having lost something in the final chapters. Deku as a quirkless hero at the end is not the same argument as Deku as a quirkless hero from the beginning. The first version would have been radical. The second version is a conclusion arrived at by subtraction, not by choice. He did not choose to be quirkless. He had the quirk taken away from him by the requirements of the plot's ending. And then he gets a special suit anyway, built by All Might, powered by support technology, giving him back a version of his abilities. So he is quirkless, but also he has a suit. That lets him do hero things. So maybe not that quirkless after all. The premise was a boy with nothing becoming a hero. The story gave him everything and then took most of it back. That is not the same thing. That was never the same thing. And no matter how emotionally resonant the journey felt in the middle sections, the fundamental disconnect between what Chapter 1 promised and what Chapter 430 delivered is something the story can never fully close. My Hero Academia told you it was going to be one kind of story, then it told a different one. Then at the very end, it gestured back toward the original, as though the detour never happened. That gap, that specific distance between the promise and the product, is the foundation everything else is built on. Because once you see it, you start asking a question that the rest of this essay is going to sit with for a long time. If Deku was always going to end up quirkless anyway, if the story was always going to circle back to the boy with nothing, then why did the series spend all that time building up a protagonist whose greatest moments were borrowed from a power he was never meant to keep, when there was another character standing right next to him the whole time, someone who had actually earned everything he had through work alone, someone who ended up being number 1 while Deku ended up being number 4. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the the channel tremendously. That character has a name. That character's story starts in the next section. And once you see what was possible with him, the story Deku got will never look quite the same. Section 2. The wrong kid got the quirk. The Mirio Togata problem. There is a moment in My Hero Academia that the show presents as a compliment to Deku and accidentally makes the entire argument against him. Deku and his classmates have just arrived at a hero agency for their internship. They are walking down a hallway when 3 older students turn a corner and walk toward them. The hallway is not especially long. The interaction lasts maybe 30 seconds, and by the time it is over, every single student from Class 1A, a group that includes Bakugo, Todoroki, and some of the most talented young heroes in the country, has gone completely still. Not because of a fight, not because of a threat, just because one of those 3 older students looked at them a certain way and smiled. That student is Mirio Togata. His hero name is Lemillion, and in that hallway, without throwing a single punch, he makes every protagonist the show has carefully developed across 3 seasons feel like they are standing at the bottom of a very tall mountain. The show means this as build-up. It is setting Mirio up as a benchmark, a measuring stick for how far Deku still has to go. But what it accidentally reveals is something the rest of the story spends years quietly trying to walk back. Mirio Togata is not a benchmark. He is a better version of the protagonist that My Hero Academia already had. He does everything the story wanted Deku to do, and he does it with his own hands, his own years of work, and a quirk that the world told him was basically useless. Let us talk about that quirk. Mirio's ability is called permeation. What it does on paper sounds incredible. He can pass through solid objects, through the ground, through walls, through other people. In practice, when he first got it as a child, it was a nightmare. When you pass through the ground, you fall. When your feet pass through the floor, you lose all grip and cannot stand. When your ears pass through something, you go deaf. When your eyes phase through, you go blind. To use permeation as a weapon, to actually fight with it, Mirio had to learn to phase specific parts of his body in and out at precise moments, time his resolidification perfectly enough to land hits, and do all of this while essentially falling blind and deaf through solid matter on purpose. Every single teacher he had told him the same thing. His quirk was not suited for hero work. He did it anyway. He spent years training alone when everyone had given up on the idea that his quirk could be made into something. He built his body into one of the strongest physical frames in the entire school. He pushed his mastery of permeation past the point where anyone thought mastery was possible. By the time the story meets him, he can phase through a wall, reappear behind you before you can turn around, and hit you hard enough that you will feel it for a week, all in about 2 seconds flat. This is the thing that separates Mirio from almost every other character in My Hero Academia, including Deku. Deku worked hard to use a power that was given to him. Mirio worked hard to turn a power that was supposed to be a curse into the best offensive tool in the building. Those are not the same thing. One of those journeys is inspiring. The other is impressive. And the show, if it had any real honesty about its own premise, would know which is which. Now here's the part that makes this more than just a fan debate. Before Deku was ever in the picture, All Might had already identified his successor. He was not still searching when he ran into Deku at that train station. He had been watching Mirio for some time. His old sidekick and closest partner, a man named Sir Night-Eye, who had worked alongside All Might for years and understood what the symbol of peace actually required, had given his full support to Mirio as the next inheritor. Night-Eye was not a casual observer. He was the most knowledgeable person alive about what One for All needed in a carrier, what the next generation of heroism demanded, and what qualities a successor had to have. Night-Eye chose Mirio. All Might was essentially in agreement. The plan was in place. And then, through a sequence of events that had nothing to do with Deku proving himself worthy and everything to do with being in the right place at the right time, All Might changed course on the spot. He saw Deku act bravely during a villain attack at a train station, felt something, and made the call. That is how the most important decision in the entire story gets made. Not through careful selection, not through a process of evaluation, through a feeling, on a platform, in about 45 minutes. The show does eventually address this. It does not flinch from the fact that several characters in-universe consider it a mistake. Night-Eye tells Deku directly and plainly that he does not believe Deku is the right person to carry One for All. This is not a throwaway comment from a minor side character. This is All Might's former partner, the person who knows the legacy of that quirk better than almost anyone alive, looking Deku in the face and saying he should not have it. That scene happens. It is canon, and the show never really refutes it so much as it just lets Deku prove himself enough that the question stops being asked. But the question should never have stopped being asked, because the Overhaul arc, which is one of the most important arcs in the series, shows you in real time what both Deku and Mirio can do under the worst possible conditions. And the comparison is not flattering for the protagonist. Mirio encounters the villain Overhaul in the street before the arc's main conflict conflict starts. He recognizes immediately that Overhaul is dangerous.
He makes a strategic decision to not confront him there, not because he is afraid, but because he is smart enough to know that a street confrontation with incomplete information would get the little girl Overhaul is with hurt. He holds back. He lets the moment pass. He gathers intelligence and returns with a plan. Deku, in that same moment, nearly escalates the situation on the spot out of emotional reaction. It is Mirio who talks him down. Then the real confrontation comes. Mirio faces Overhaul in a full fight, and he is winning. Not barely winning, actually winning. He is one of the most dangerous villains in the series, a man who can disassemble and rebuild matter with a touch, and Mirio is handling him. Then a quirk-destroying bullet hits Mirio. His permeation is gone. He has no power anymore. He keeps fighting. Without his quirk, Mirio holds off Overhaul for a significant amount of time to protect the child, Eri. He has no power. He has his training, his body, and his refusal to stop. He does not win that fight in the end, but he keeps fighting until he physically cannot anymore. Deku eventually defeats Overhaul, but the way he defeats him is telling. He does not beat Overhaul on his own. Eri's ability, which allows her to rewind a person's body back to a previous state, is what makes it possible. Without Eri undoing the damage Deku's body keeps taking, Deku could not sustain the level of power needed to finish the fight. He wins, but the victory belongs to several people at once, including the child he was trying to save. Mirio was winning alone before he lost his quirk. The show understands that this comparison is uncomfortable. After this arc, Deku himself turns to Mirio and offers to give him one for all. He says out loud that Mirio deserves it more. Mirio turns him down, but the offer exists, and it is in the story, and it means that even the protagonist himself looks at what Mirio did and privately agrees with Night Eye's original assessment.
The story has Mirio decline the offer so that Deku can continue, but the fact that the offer gets made at all is the show trying to close a door that it knows it left open. Now add one more layer to this. Kohei Horikoshi himself, in an interview with Tite Kubo, the man who created Bleach, talked about Mirio and said something that every fan of this series should sit with. He said Mirio was his favorite character. He said his biggest regret about how the story developed was that he did not have room to show Mirio's full emotional range. He said that because of the way the story was structured, Mirio ended up being reduced to something closer to a tool the plot used, rather than a fully realized person the story explored. The creator of My Hero Academia looked back at what he had built and told another manga legend that his single biggest character regret was the person who should have been the protagonist. That is not a fan reading. That is not an interpretation. That is the man who wrote every page of this story, saying in his own words that he did not do justice to the character he now considers his favorite, and that the reason he did not was because the story's structure around Deku left no room for it. Mirio's arc in the story, to be completely honest about it, is a series of losses that the story uses to make other characters more interesting. He loses his quirk so that the Overhaul arc has emotional weight. He is quirkless for a long stretch of the story so that his eventual recovery feels like a win. He ends up as #1 hero in the epilogue, which is the show trying to give him his due, but it happens off the page, in a time skip, summarized in a ranking chart rather than shown in full. He gets his destination, he does not get his journey. Meanwhile, Deku, who was less interesting from the beginning, gets everything. Every training arc, every emotional breakdown, every major villain encounter, every moment of growth and crisis and decision and consequence. The camera never leaves him. The story never asks whether he is the right center for all of this. It just keeps pointing there, keeps piling the significant moments onto the character who started with everything handed to him, while the character who genuinely earned every skill and every quality and every instinct that heroism requires stands slightly to the side and waits for his handful of chapters. There is also something that the epilogue quietly admits that most discussions of MHA skip over. In the post-series rankings, 8 years after the final war, Mirio Togata is the #1 hero in Japan. Deku is #4. The story that opened with Deku saying he would become the greatest hero ends with him being the 4th greatest hero, while the person who arguably should have been the protagonist all along sits at the top of the chart. The show presents this as a happy ending for both of them. Maybe it is. But read it again, knowing everything. Knowing Horikoshi's regret, knowing Night Eye's original judgment, knowing the Overhaul fight, knowing the offer Deku made, and it starts to look like something else. It looks like the story, at the very end, quietly admitting what it spent years refusing to say directly. The right person ended up at the top. He just was not the one the story was about. And that tension, the fact that My Hero Academia built a protagonist who could never fully claim the throne the premise set up, while the person who deserved it most was right there the whole time, is not just a flaw in one character's arc. It is a flaw that runs straight through the story's bones. Because here's the thing about giving Deku the most powerful quirk in the series and centering the story on him. The story is not just making a choice about who to follow. It is making a statement about what kind of effort the world rewards. And the statement My
My Hero Academia makes, not intentionally, but structurally, by the choices it makes on the page, is that the effort Mirio put in was great, admirable, worth honoring, but not worth the story. That is a quiet cruelty the show never fully reckons with, and it connects directly to a larger problem, one that goes beyond just the question of who deserved the quirk and cuts into the very heart of what this story was supposed to mean. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Because the decision to give Deku one for all did not just change who the protagonist was, it broke the argument the story was trying to make, and understanding exactly how it broke it requires looking at what My Hero Academia was actually trying to say about the world it built, and how completely it said the opposite. Section 3. The premise kills its own theme. Why giving Deku a quirk proved society right. My Hero Academia has one of the most clearly stated themes of any shonen manga ever written. The world it builds is one where having a superpower is completely normal. Around 80% of all people on Earth are born with some kind of ability. The other 20% are born without one. And those people, the quirkless, are treated as lesser. Not always loudly, not always cruelly, but the gap is there from the very beginning. Kids with powers get praised. Kids without them get pitied. Adults speak carefully. Doctors deliver the news like a diagnosis. And society, piece by piece, has built itself around the assumption that power equals worth. That assumption is the villain of My Hero Academia. Not all for one, not the League of Villains. The real thing the story is fighting against is a world that decided what a person is worth before that person ever gets a chance to prove anything. The quirkless are excluded from hero programs. They are told there is no path for them. They are handed a ceiling and expected to accept it. Deku, as a concept, is supposed to be the answer to that. He is the boy who the world told there was no path for. He is the one who was supposed to walk through anyway. Find a way through pure human effort and intelligence and will, and prove to every quirkless kid watching that the ceiling the world put above them was a lie. That is the emotional contract the story makes with its audience in those early pages. That is the reason the setup works. That is why so many people connect with those first few episodes. Because the fantasy being sold is not just about becoming a hero. It is about a world that excluded you being proven wrong. And then the story hands Deku the most powerful quirk in existence and proves the world right instead. This is not a complicated reading. It is the most direct possible interpretation of what happens. Hero Society says you need a quirk to be a hero. My Hero Academia responds by giving the quirkless protagonist a quirk. The world told Deku he could not do it without power. The story agreed and gave him power. The prejudice of Hero Society, the central injustice the story is supposedly positioned against, is quietly confirmed in Chapter 3 and never meaningfully challenged again. What makes this particularly striking is how clearly the story understands its own premise. This is not a case of a writer accidentally undermining a theme they did not notice. Horikoshi knows what he built. The prejudice against quirkless people is not background detail. It is present in nearly every major arc. Characters reference it. Villains were created by it. Shigaraki's entire origin is tied to a world that failed someone who needed help. The story keeps returning to the idea that Hero Society is broken, that the way it measures human worth is wrong, that the system needs to change. But it never lets Deku be the proof of that change while he actually has power. Deku, with One for All, does not challenge Hero Society's assumptions. He confirms them. He gets into UA because he has a quirk. He earns his license because he has a quirk. He fights villains, saves people, and builds his reputation entirely on the back of an ability he was given. The argument his existence was supposed to make, that a person without power can still be a hero, is not being made during any of this. It is being postponed until after the story ends, when he loses the quirk in the final battle and continues as a teacher. But postponing the proof is not the same as making it. The story needed Deku to prove the theme while the theme mattered, not as a footnote, not as a result of losing something in the final arc. During the story, in the moments that count, in the fights and the decisions and the growth, that is when the argument needed to be made. Instead, every time Deku does something remarkable, the unremarkable explanation is available. He has the strongest quirk. Of course he survived. Of course he won. Of course he grew stronger. He had the best possible head start. There is a specific moment that makes this almost painfully clear. When Deku first receives One for All Might tells him that the quirk chose him. Not that Deku earned it through some long process of demonstrated worth. Not that Deku passed a test or met a standard. All Might saw him act bravely once and decided on the spot. The quirk is transferable. It can be passed to anyone All Might chooses. It was passed to 7 people before Deku. It could have gone to anyone. It went to Deku because of a feeling. And then All Might says, plainly and directly, that without a quirk, Deku cannot become a hero. This is not a villain saying this. This is not an ignorant bystander. This is All Might, the greatest hero alive, the symbol of peace, the person the story holds up as the standard of
what heroism looks like, telling the boy he is about to mentor that the world the story is criticizing is correct. You cannot be a hero without power. Here, have power. The story's hero confirms the story's stated villain before the story has even properly started. Now, here is where the problem deepens past the surface level, because My Hero Academia is not just a story about one boy. It is a story about a whole society. And that society, Hero Society, as the characters call it, is shown across the series to have serious problems. The way it treats the quirkless is one of them. The way it creates the conditions for people to become villains is another. Shigaraki is not born evil. He is a child who reaches out for help repeatedly, is failed by every adult around him, and gets shaped into a weapon by the one person who did reach back. That is a story about what systems do to people when they are broken. The question the story keeps circling is this: what needs to change? Deku, as the protagonist, should be the answer to that question in a visible, active way. He should be the person whose existence reshapes what Hero Society believes is possible. The quirkless boy who became a hero not because someone handed him power, but because he found another way. That version of Deku would have been proof, evidence, a walking argument that the system's assumptions were wrong. Instead, Deku enters the system with the most powerful quirk in it and rises through that system normally. He does not challenge it from outside. He does not find a crack in it that a quirkless person could exploit. He uses his power to climb. The system, looking at Deku, does not need to question any of its assumptions. It sees a very powerful quirk user doing what very powerful quirk users do. By the end of the series, and this matters, Deku is ranked number 4 in Japan. That ranking is based on hero work done while powered. The quirkless version of Deku does not have a ranking because the quirkless version of Deku barely exists inside the story's active timeline. He shows up at the beginning, disappears almost immediately,
and reappears at the very end as a result of loss rather than choice. The story wanted to say, quirkless people have worth. What it showed was, this particular quirkless person was chosen by the greatest hero alive, given the greatest power in existence, and did well with it. Those are not the same message. One of them challenges the world, the other one works within it. And there is a further layer here that rarely gets discussed, because the story does not just give Deku one for all. Over the course of the series, one for all grows. The quirks of every previous user are stored inside it, and one by one, Deku gains access to them. By the later arcs, he has 6 additional abilities on top of the base power boost. He can produce long, dark tendrils. He can float. He can release stored energy in massive bursts. He can create shockwaves. Each new ability arrives at a moment when the plot needs Deku to have more power. Each one is framed as a reward for effort or emotional growth, but the structural reality is simpler than that. The story kept needing its protagonist to be stronger, so it kept giving him more. The hard work theme that the early arcs built, the idea that Deku's growth was earned through pain and discipline, quietly fades once the vestige quirks start unlocking. At that point, Deku is not working harder than anyone else. He is unlocking a collection of abilities that were always waiting inside him. The underdog story did not just end when he got the quirk. It ended by degrees, over several seasons, every time a new ability appeared that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with inheritance. What was supposed to be a story about a person with nothing building something from scratch became a story about a person managing and unlocking an increasingly large inheritance. And no matter how emotionally the story dressed that up, the bones of it were always the same. Deku had more than anyone. He just had to learn to use it. The world of My Hero Academia needed someone to prove its central prejudice wrong. Its protagonist was uniquely positioned to be that proof. He had the origin, the motivation, the emotional history, and the audience's goodwill, all pointing in the same direction. He just never got to make the argument that mattered most, because the story decided, very early and very quietly, that the argument was too hard to make with a quirkless protagonist. So it gave him a quirk and moved on. But it never stopped gesturing at the argument it abandoned. It never stopped bringing up Hero Society's failures. It never stopped showing the damage done to people the system excluded. It kept setting up the question while refusing to actually answer it with the evidence it had available, its own main character. That is a specific kind of storytelling failure. Not the kind where a writer did not know what they were doing. The kind where a writer knew exactly what they wanted to say, lost the nerve to say it the hard way, and spent the rest of the story dancing around the silence where the answer should have been. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And if the premise being broken and the theme being undermined were the only problems, that would almost be enough to build a full case on. But there is a third issue that runs alongside both of these, one that lives entirely inside Deku himself, not in the world around him. It is not about what the story gave him. It is about what the story never let him actually learn. And once you see it, every arc starts to look a little different. Section 4. Aesop Amnesia, the character who never learns anything permanently. Every good story about a person growing up has the same basic engine underneath
underneath it. The character faces something hard. They struggle with it. They make a mistake or get hurt or lose something because of a flaw they carry.
And then, and this is the part that matters, they actually change. Not perfectly, not all at once, but something shifts, something moves, and the person who faces the next hard thing is genuinely different from the person who faced the last one. That movement, that real, visible, permanent change is what character development actually means. Deku has a flaw. It is one of the most clearly defined character flaws in the entire series, stated plainly by multiple characters across multiple seasons, including some of the most respected adults in the story. The flaw is this: when things get serious, when the people he cares about are in danger, Deku stops thinking about himself entirely. He throws his body at the problem. He acts alone. He takes on everything by himself and refuses to let anyone else carry any of the weight. Not because he is arrogant, but because he genuinely believes that if he is the one who gets destroyed, at least nobody else will be. That sounds noble. In small doses, it reads as noble. But played out across an entire series, across fight after fight and arc after arc, it becomes something else. It becomes a pattern. And a pattern that never actually breaks is not character development. It is the illusion of character development wearing the costume of growth. Here is how the pattern works in practice. In the overhaul arc, Deku pushes his body so far past its limits that the damage to his arms becomes a real and serious long-term problem. Recovery Girl, the school nurse who has healed him multiple times, tells him directly that she will not heal him again if he keeps doing this to himself. She is not being cruel. She is telling him that his body is accumulating damage faster than it can be undone, and that at some point the harm will be permanent. He hears this. He understands it. He continues doing exactly the same thing in the next major fight. That is the first full cycle of the pattern. Then comes the training and internship period, where Gran Torino and other mentors repeatedly push the same message from a different angle. Stop trying to handle everything alone. A hero who burns themselves out protecting one person cannot protect the next 10. There is wisdom in restraint. There is power in having people beside you. Deku agrees. He grows, visibly and genuinely, across these sections. He gets better at working with others. He starts to trust his classmates in combat situations he would previously have tried to own entirely. And then something big happens, and the pattern resets. The clearest and most extreme version of this comes in Season 6, during what the anime officially calls the Black Hero arc, though most fans know it as the Dark Deku arc. By this point in the story, Japan has partially collapsed. The prison system has failed. Thousands of dangerous criminals are loose. Hero society is crumbling under the weight of the war against Shigaraki and All for One. And Deku, who knows that All for One is specifically hunting him because of One for All, makes a decision. He leaves UA alone. He writes letters to his classmates explaining why he has to go. He puts on a worn-out costume. He stops sleeping properly, stops eating properly, stops taking care of his body in any meaningful way. He roams across a broken Japan by himself, hunting down escaped villains one at a time, running purely on the belief that if he can just keep moving, just keep taking hits, just stay in motion long enough, he can solve the whole problem through personal sacrifice. He looks terrible by the time his classmates find him. Not dramatically terrible in a cool way, actually terrible. Exhausted, hollow-eyed, barely functional. A kid who has been running on nothing for too long because he convinced himself that the cost of asking for help was too high. His classmates track him down. They fight him because he will not stop and listen any other way. One by one, they make their case. And then Bakugo, the person who bullied Deku for years, the last person in the story you would expect to be the one to break through, calls him by his real name, Izuku, for the first time. He apologizes for everything. He tells Deku that his choices were not wrong, but that he cannot carry this alone, that the only way forward is together, that nobody is asking him to stop fighting, just to stop fighting by himself. Deku collapses. He comes back to UA. This is genuinely moving. The scene works. Bakugo's apology is one of the most earned emotional moments in the series. But here is the thing. Step back from how the scene feels and look at what it is actually saying about Deku's arc. This is the third or fourth time, depending on how you count, that the story has run this exact sequence. Deku pushes himself too far alone. The people around him reach out and pull him back. He accepts their help. Something shifts. And then, the next time the pressure gets high enough, the same thing happens again. By the time you are watching Bakugo's apology land in Season 6, you have already watched Deku learn this lesson. You have watched him learn it and demonstrate that he learned it, and then quietly forget it when the stakes got high enough again. The lesson did not stick. Not in the permanent way that real character development sticks. TV Tropes, the website that catalogs storytelling patterns across thousands of pieces of media, has a specific name for this. They call it Aesop amnesia. It means exactly what it sounds like. A character learns a lesson, the story acknowledges the lesson, and then the lesson evaporates by the next time it would be inconvenient. The character goes back to their old behavior, as though the growth never happened, and the story treats the next instance of learning the same
same lesson as though it is new. My Hero Academia does not just have Aesop amnesia with Deku, it has it repeatedly, with the same lesson, with the same flaw, in the same pattern. Which means that Deku's central arc, the internal journey of his character, is not a line moving forward. It is a loop, a circle that keeps returning to the same point. Now compare this to the arcs happening around him. Bakugo starts the series as a person whose entire identity is built on being better than everyone else. His self-worth is completely tied to his power and his rankings. Any hint that someone might be close to his level sends him into something close to rage. He is genuinely cruel to Deku for years, not just thoughtless or careless, but deliberately, specifically cruel. And then he changes. Not all at once, slowly, painfully, with backslides and complications and moments of genuine ugliness along the way. But by the end of the series, Bakugo is a meaningfully different person from the one who opened it. His relationship to winning has shifted. His relationship to other people has shifted. His relationship to Deku, which is the most important one, has shifted from something toxic into something that, while still competitive, is actually built on respect. The change is visible and real, and it does not reset. Todoroki starts the series essentially split in half. His mother poured cold water on his left arm when he was a child because his left side reminded her of his father, who abused her. He refuses to use his fire side as a result. His entire fighting style is a form of protest against a man who hurt him. He is talented and capable, and almost entirely frozen inside. Then Deku, during the UA Sports Festival, says something to him that cracks the wall. And across the rest of the series, Todoroki moves, slowly, with setbacks but genuinely, toward a version of himself that can use both sides and can separate his father's ambition from his own identity. By the end, he is someone who has processed his trauma enough to act, rather than being acted on by it. These arcs move. They have a start point, a middle, and an end point that is meaningfully different from where they began. Deku's arc returns to the same place. The self-sacrifice that is played as a flaw in Season 1 is still functionally present in Season 6. The inability to ask for help that shapes his early mistakes is still shaping his behavior during the Dark Hero arc. The story keeps framing these relapses as dramatic and emotionally significant, and they are, but drama is not the same as development. A character can have a powerful emotional scene and still not have grown. The scene in the rain where Bakugo finally apologizes would hit harder if Deku reaching this low point felt like a genuine surprise, like behavior the story had established he moved past. Instead, it feels like an escalation of a loop that has been running since the beginning. The story built a protagonist with a clear flaw, surrounded him with characters whose flaws actually evolved, and kept pressing reset on his central lesson while the world around him moved forward. That is the Aesop amnesia problem in Deku's story. It is not a small issue. It is the structural core of why, after 20-something episodes and hundreds of chapters, something still feels off about his arc in a way that is hard to name but easy to feel. You are rooting for him. You want him to get there, but the destination keeps moving because the lesson keeps being unlearned. And at some point, the story owes you an honest answer to the question of whether he ever truly learned it at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But there is one part of Deku's story where the problem is not about what he failed to learn. It is about what he was never properly taught, and what the adults and the system around him refused to address. On something that affects real people in real classrooms and real hallways every single day. Section 5. The bullying problem. Emha never actually solved. There is a line in the very first chapter of My Hero Academia that most people who have seen the anime remember, even if they do not remember it word for word. Bakugo looks at Deku, his childhood classmate, the boy he has known since they were small children, and tells him to take a running start off the school roof. He is telling a quirkless kid, who has already been told by a doctor that his dream of becoming a hero is impossible, to go kill himself. He says it casually, like it is not a big deal, like it is just another thing you say to someone you have decided does not matter. Deku's response in that moment is not anger. It is not devastation. He mutters quietly that Bakugo should not say things like that because someone who is actually struggling might hear it and take it seriously. He is worried, in the moment of receiving one of the cruelest things one person can say to another, about other people who might be hurt by the words. That detail tells you everything about who Deku is. And it tells you everything about what the story is about to ask of him for the next 430 chapters. Because what My Hero Academia asks of Deku, quietly, consistently, across its entire run, is to absorb an enormous amount of harm from Bakugo and to be the bigger person about it every time. Without the story ever properly addressing the fact that being the bigger person is not the same as healing. And without any adult in Deku's life ever actually stepping in to stop what was happening to him. Let us be honest about what Bakugo did to Deku, because the story sometimes moves through it quickly enough enough that it is easy to underestimate the weight of it. From the time they were small children through their first year at UA, which is where the main story takes place, Bakugo bullied Deku. Not teased, not bothered. Bullied, in the specific and serious sense of the word. He used his quirk,
which produces explosions, to physically intimidate and hurt someone he knew had no way to fight back. He took Deku's notebooks, the hero analysis journals that Deku had spent years filling with careful observations about every hero he had ever studied, and threw them out a window into a pond. He called Deku useless repeatedly, over years, in front of other people. He made sure that the name Deku, which in Japanese carries the meaning of someone who is worthless and cannot do anything, became the name everyone around them used, so that Deku could not even hear his own nickname without being reminded of what Bakugo thought of him. And Deku never stopped looking up to him. That detail is not presented as a problem by the story. It is presented as part of Deku's nature, his ability to see the good in people, even when they are treating him badly. He calls Bakugo Kachan, a warm and friendly nickname throughout the entire series. Even at the moments of Bakugo's worst behavior, Deku's internal narration treats him as someone to admire and learn from. He compares Bakugo to All Might at one point, his literal hero, the greatest person he knows, in terms of the drive and passion Bakugo represents to him. The story treats this as touching. It is also, if you look at it honestly, a portrait of someone who has been conditioned by years of mistreatment to normalize that mistreatment. Deku does not have a healthy relationship with Bakugo's behavior. He has a relationship with it that was shaped by receiving that behavior before he was old enough to know what to call it or how to respond. Now, here is where the story's handling of this becomes a genuine problem rather than just an uncomfortable character detail. Nobody stops it. Not one adult in Deku's life intervenes meaningfully while the bullying is happening. Not his mother, who clearly loves him but does not take visible action. Not his middle school teachers, who would have witnessed, at minimum, the social dynamics between these two students. Not All Might, who is aware of their history by the time he starts mentoring Deku and does not address it directly with either of them for a long time. The adults around Deku treat his ability to endure Bakugo as a quality to be admired rather than a situation to be fixed. Yuwa High School, which is supposed to be the best hero school in the country, the institution training the next generation of people who will protect society, does not meaningfully address the fact that one of its students spent years being bullied by another student currently in his class. There are no documented consequences for Bakugo. There is no support structure offered to Deku. The school moves forward as though the history between these two students is just a personality conflict, rather than years of documented harm. The story's solution to this is Bakugo's redemption arc, and here is where it is necessary to be precise, because the redemption arc is real, and it does meaningful things. Bakugo changes across the series in ways that are genuine and visible. His relationship to his own ego shifts. His understanding of what strength actually means evolves. By the time he delivers his apology to Deku in Season 6, calling him Izuku, his actual name, for the first time, there is real weight behind it. Bakugo is not performing, he means it. But the apology, as moving as it is, does not fix the structural problem the story created. Bakugo's apology in Chapter 322 comes after years of continued difficult behavior at UA. Years during which the bullying from childhood did not simply stop so much as shift in form. He was still aggressive with Deku regularly. He was still dismissive, still explosive, still someone who made Deku's environment harder to exist in. The apology arrives at a moment of crisis, when Japan is falling apart and Bakugo needs Deku to come back.
It is sincere, but sincerity and timing matter in apologies. And an apology delivered at the moment you need something from someone carries a different weight than one delivered simply because it was the right thing to do. More importantly, the apology lands on Deku as a responsibility. The story puts the weight of accepting or rejecting that apology entirely on Deku, not on the adults who should have acted, not on the institution that looked away, not on the culture that praised Bakugo's power so relentlessly that it helped create the conditions for his behavior. Deku is the one who has to decide whether this is enough. Deku is the one who has to be emotionally ready to receive it, process it, and move forward. The victim carries the work of the resolution. That is a real and documented problem in how stories handle bullying. When the narrative puts the emotional labor of a bully's redemption onto the person they bullied, it sends a message, not deliberately perhaps, but structurally. It says that the way out of this situation runs through the victim's generosity, that the victim's job is to be understanding enough, patient enough, big-hearted enough for the arc to resolve cleanly. Deku is all of those things. He is extraordinarily understanding and patient and big-hearted, but the fact that he has to be, the fact that the story requires those qualities of him to make Bakugo's arc work, is the story offloading its own responsibility onto its protagonist. A story that took this seriously would have shown consequences for Bakugo's behavior before his change of heart. It would have shown adults acting. It would have shown the institution failing and then being held accountable for that failure. It would have made the point that a bully's internal journey
journey, however real and however meaningful, does not cancel the harm already done. And that the measure of a redemption is not just whether the person apologizes, but whether the world around them actually changes. My Hero Academia shows the personal redemption without the structural accountability, and in doing so, it teaches something with its story that it almost certainly did not intend to teach. It teaches that the right response to being bullied is patience and generosity, that the person being hurt should wait, should absorb it, should keep the door open, should be ready to accept the apology when it finally comes, that the adults not acting is just the background of the story, not a problem requiring its own answer. For a series watched by enormous numbers of young people, many of whom are in schools right now, in situations not entirely unlike the one between Deku and Bakugo, that is a meaningful failure. Not a catastrophic one, not one that cancels everything the story does well, but a real one. Deku deserved adults who acted. He deserved a school that saw what was happening and responded to it. He deserved a story that let him be angry about what was done to him. Genuinely angry, not just quietly sad, without framing that anger as a flaw in him. He did not get those things. He got a beautiful apology scene that the audience loved, wrapped around a structure that asked him to be the solution to a problem he was the victim of. And there is one more quiet irony sitting at the end of all this. Bakugo, by the end of the story, ranks number 5 among Japan's professional heroes. Deku ranks number 4. The boy who told Deku to go kill himself in Chapter 1 ends up one step below the boy he said it to. The story probably intends that as a kind of justice. Deku ahead, Bakugo behind, the natural order of things. But one position on a chart does not weigh the same as years of harm. And the story, for all its emotional intelligence in other areas, never quite found the language to say that clearly. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That gap between what happened and what the story said about what happened runs through Deku's entire arc. It connects to a larger problem, one about the world the story built around him, about the characters who ended up being far more compelling than he was, and about why the most interesting people in My Hero Academia are almost always the ones standing just outside the spotlight he was standing in. Section 6. The support cast runs laps around him, why everyone else is more interesting. There is a version of My Hero Academia that is one of the greatest shonen stories ever told. It lives in the side characters. Walk through the cast of this series honestly, one by one, and what you find is remarkable. Character after character who is doing more complicated, more layered, more emotionally interesting work than the protagonist the story keeps pointing the camera at. Not by accident. Not because Horikoshi forgot to develop his main character while developing everyone else, but because the world of My Hero Academia is genuinely deeply rich, and the one person at the center of it is the least complicated person in the building. Start with Endeavor. Endeavor is introduced as the number 2 hero, a man who has spent his entire career furious that All Might exists, because All Might's presence means Endeavor can never be number 1, no matter what he does. He responds to this by doing something genuinely terrible. He selects a wife with a powerful ice ability, has children with her specifically to produce an heir with both his fire ability and her ice, and when those children do not meet his standards, discards them emotionally. He puts everything into Shoto, his youngest, and trains him so brutally that Shoto's mother eventually has a breakdown and pours boiling water on Shoto's face because looking at him reminds her of his father. Endeavor does all of this. It is in the story. It is not softened. And then All Might retires. Endeavor becomes the number 1 hero by default, and the story watches what happens when a man who built his whole life around reaching a goal finally reaches it in the worst possible way. Not through triumph, but through the person he was chasing simply being gone. He does not feel what he thought he would feel. He looks at his family and sees the damage. He has to decide, at the back half of his life, whether he is capable of becoming something different from what he has always been. That is a story about ego and damage, and the possibility of change in people who have done real harm. It is genuinely difficult material, handled with more honesty than most shonen would attempt. Endeavor's arc does not fully redeem him. The story is careful about that, but it shows a man in the process of reckoning, which is a more honest thing to show than either clean redemption or permanent condemnation. Deku has no equivalent complexity. He has never done meaningful harm that he has to reckon with. His arc does not require him to face the gap between who he wanted to be and who his choices made him. He has always been essentially good, and the story confirms that goodness rather than testing it. Now look at Todoroki. Shoto Todoroki is introduced as cold, distant, and nearly impossible to read. He is the most naturally talented student at UA. He has a fire side and an ice side, inherited from his parents, and he refuses to use his fire in any fight. He will win with only half of what he has before he will touch the ability that connects him to his father. This is a person whose trauma has become his fighting style. His refusal is not weakness. It is the most control he has ever had over something his father tried to own. And watching Deku crack that wall during the sports festival, not through fighting Todoroki harder, but by refusing to let Todoroki use their fight as a place to just go go through the motions, push him until something genuine comes out, is one of the best scenes the series produces. But here is the thing. That scene is about Todoroki. Deku is a tool the scene uses to unlock something in someone else. He is the key that opens the door. The door is Todoroki, and Todoroki is the one with something worth opening. This happens repeatedly with Deku. He serves as a catalyst for other people's more interesting stories. He is the emotional pressure that makes Bakugo reckon with his own insecurity. He is the person whose quirkless origin forces the story to examine what hero society values. He is the one whose presence in Mirio's life prompts the question of who deserved the inheritance. Again and again, Deku functions best as a mirror held up to the people around him. And mirrors, whatever else they are not the most interesting thing in the room. Look at Hawks. Hawks is the number 2 hero after Endeavor. He is charming and relaxed and appears to be everything a popular pro-hero should look like. Quick with a joke, easy to be around, genuinely skilled. And underneath all of that, he is running a deep undercover operation inside the League of Villains, feeding information to the hero side while pretending to be moving toward the villains. He is doing something that will cost him enormously regardless of how it ends, because he is going to have to either betray people who trusted him or fail the side he is actually working for. Hawks has a past that the story reveals carefully, a childhood of poverty and neglect, saved by a hero poster on a wall, shaped by the hero commission into something that serves their purposes. He is not entirely free, he never has been, and the choices he makes inside that constraint are the most morally complicated ones any hero in the series makes. Deku's choices are almost never morally complicated. He wants to save people. He tries to save people. Sometimes he saves them at great personal cost. The cost is always physical, his body, rather than moral. He never has to choose between two things that both matter in ways that cannot be reconciled. He never has to do something genuinely wrong in service of something genuinely right. The characters around him have to do that all the time. Look at Twice, a villain, not a hero, but one of the most emotionally precise characters in the series. Twice has a quirk that allows him to make copies of people and objects. At some point, he lost track of which version of himself was the original. He spent time genuinely unable to confirm his own existence. He found a sense of belonging in the League of Villains, not because he wanted to hurt people, but because it was the first place that felt like family. When Hawks kills him, it is one of the most brutal emotional moments in the series, because Twice dies believing in people who believed in him, in a world that never gave him a fair chance to be anything else. Twice has maybe 30 episodes of meaningful screen time. He is more emotionally complicated in those 30 episodes than Deku is across the full run. This is not a small problem. In storytelling, the protagonist is supposed to be the most interesting person in the room. Not necessarily the most powerful or the most skilled, but the most interesting. The one whose internal life is rich enough, whose contradictions are sharp enough, whose journey is specific enough that following them across hundreds of episodes feels like it means something. My Hero Academia broke this rule badly. Its most interesting internal lives belong to Bakugo, Todoroki, Endeavor, Hawks, Shigaraki, and Twice. Its protagonist is defined almost entirely by a single quality, self-sacrifice, and a single relationship, his connection to All Might's legacy. Remove those two things and there is very little left that is specific to Deku as a person. Bakugo without his ego and his journey through it is barely Bakugo. Todoroki without his trauma and his slow movement through it is barely Todoroki. These characters are their complications. Take the complications away and they dissolve. Deku without his quirk journey is still basically Deku. Earnest, kind, selfless, determined, all admirable qualities, none of them sharp enough to cut with. The CBR analysis that documented this put it plainly. Deku's plainness is consistently outshined by his classmates. Not in terms of power, he ends up among the most powerful people in the series, but in terms of the texture of who he is as a person, the things that make a fictional human being feel like a real one, he is thinner than almost everyone around him, and the audience has always known this, even when they could not name it. The consistent pattern across fan communities, Reddit, YouTube comments, fandom wikis, Quora discussions, is that when people talk about My Hero Academia with genuine passion, they are almost never talking about Deku. They are talking about Bakugo's arc, Todoroki's ice and fire, Endeavor's reckoning, Shigaraki's origin, Hawks' impossible position. Deku comes up as the person these conversations revolve around, not the person people find themselves most drawn to. He is the sun that everyone orbits, but the planets are the ones people watch. That gap between structural importance and actual emotional resonance is the quiet center of My Hero Academia's protagonist problem. The show built something extraordinary around Deku. It just never quite built Deku. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, which makes what happens to him in Season
Season 6 so fascinating and so frustrating, because for a brief stretch of episodes, the series accidentally found the version of Deku that could have competed with the richness of the world around him. A version that was broken and complicated and genuinely hard to look at.
A version that the show discovered, held for a moment, and then carefully put away. Section 7. The Dark Deku Arc. The most interesting version of this character, abandoned after 6 episodes. Something strange happens in Season 6 of My Hero Academia. For the first time in the entire series, Deku becomes genuinely hard to watch. Not hard to watch because he is losing a fight or because something bad is happening to someone he loves. Hard to watch in the specific way that real, complicated, uncomfortable people are hard to watch. Because he is making choices that you understand completely and that are clearly destroying him, and nobody can stop him, and the story is not softening it or wrapping it in music that tells you how to feel. He looks awful. His costume is torn and worn down. His eyes have gone flat in a way that is different from focused or determined. They have gone flat in the way that eyes go flat when a person has stopped sleeping and stopped eating and stopped caring about the version of themselves that exists outside of the task. He is running on nothing. He has been running on nothing for a while, and he is not going to stop. This is the Black Hero arc, officially named by the anime as such, known by most fans as the Dark Deku arc, and it is, without much competition, the most genuinely interesting stretch of Deku's story in the entire series. Here is what leads to it. After the war against Shigaraki and the League of Villains, Japan is in pieces. The prison called Tartarus, which held the most dangerous criminals in the country, has been broken open. Thousands of villains are loose. Hero Society, which was already showing cracks, has partially collapsed. People have stopped trusting heroes. Some civilians are actively hostile toward them. The country looks like something that has been hit very hard and does not know yet whether it is going to recover. And Deku, who knows that All for One is specifically hunting him because of the power he carries, makes a decision. He is the target. As long as he is near the people he cares about, those people are in danger. He has to remove himself from the equation. He leaves UA at night, writes letters to his classmates explaining why he cannot stay, and walks out alone into a broken country to hunt down every escaped villain he can find before All for One reaches him. This version of Deku is doing something the show has never let him do before. He is acting on pure instinct rather than trained response. He is making a choice that the adults around him would not sanction, and the institution he belongs to would not approve. He has stopped performing the role of the good student and the worthy successor, and is just surviving. Moving forward because stopping feels like dying. Fighting because fighting is the only language he has left for how much he cares about the people he walked away from. The visual language of these episodes is doing real work. His costume gets progressively worse. Gran Torino's cape, which he wears as a connection to a mentor who was injured protecting him, gets more battered with every episode. His face in these sequences is not heroic in any recognizable way. It is the face of someone running out of time and knowing it, who has decided that the running out is acceptable as long as the people he loves get to be safe. There is a fight in this arc against the villain Muscular, a man Deku fought once before, during the forest training camp attack in Season 3, in one of the most physically brutal fights of the early series. Muscular is enormous and nearly unstoppable, and specifically enjoys fighting people. When Deku finds him in Season 6, the fight is completely different from their first one. Not because Deku is dramatically more powerful, though he is. Different because of what Deku looks like during it. He is not nervous. He is not pushing through fear. He moves through the fight with a cold efficiency that looks almost nothing like the boy who cried after almost every major fight in the early seasons. Muscular, who approached the rematch looking for a real contest, does not get one. He gets taken apart. That shift from the emotional, crying, self-doubting Deku of the early series to this hollow, efficient, barely holding together version is genuinely compelling television. It is the show asking a question it almost never asks about its protagonist. What does it cost to be this person? Not physically, not in broken bones and hospital stays, but what does it cost inside, in the place where a person keeps their sense of self? Dark Deku does not have a clear answer to that question. He has just stopped asking it. Then there is the fight with Lady Nagant. Lady Nagant is a former hero, a pro who worked for the Hero Public Safety Commission, the government body that oversees Hero Society. She killed people on their orders. Terrorists, corrupt heroes, anyone the commission decided was a problem that needed disappearing quietly. She followed orders until she could not anymore, snapped, killed a commission official, and was put in prison. All for One releases her and sends her after Deku. What makes this fight important is not the action. It is the conversation inside the action. Lady Nagant has seen the inside of the machine that makes heroes. She has done the work the public face of heroism requires to stay clean. And she tells Deku, while she is shooting at him, that the society he is trying to protect is built on foundations that the people running it do not want examined. That the trust people place in heroes was manufactured and maintained through things done in darkness that those
those same people would be horrified to know about. Deku listens. He does not dismiss it. He takes the shot and keeps moving, and at the end of the fight, when Lady Nagant is falling from the sky after All for One detonates, something he got her as punishment for starting to lose, Deku catches her. He does not arrest her cleanly, or leave her or treat her as the enemy who just spent 20 minutes trying to kill him. He catches her because she is falling, and catching falling people is the thing he does. That moment, the exhausted, hollow-eyed, barely functional Deku catching the woman who was just shooting at him because she is falling and he cannot not catch her, is the most purely Deku moment in the entire arc. It is the one flash of the person underneath the survival mode, and it works precisely because of the contrast with everything around it. The warmth lands harder because the coldness has been so consistent. This arc had room to grow into something extraordinary. Geku one stretch with this version of Deku. More fights, more conversations like the one with Lady Nagant, more time in the space between the hero he was trained to be and the person he is when the training falls away. Could have been the character development the series had begun building toward without realizing it. The complicated, morally gray, genuinely unpredictable version of this protagonist that the rest of the series spent 6 seasons accidentally setting up. Geku, it lasted 6 episodes. Then Class 1A found him. The reunion sequence is emotionally effective. Each classmate makes their case. Uraraka talks about what he means to the class. Ida talks about what it means to carry things alone. Bakugo finally apologizes and calls him Izuku and catches him when he collapses. Deku comes back to UA. The arc ends, and Dark Deku, as a version of this character, essentially disappears. Geku does not stay complicated after this. The coldness does not remain as a layer of who he is now, something the story builds on and develops further. He returns to something closer to the Deku of before, still serious,
still carrying more weight than he did in the early seasons, but no longer the hollow, efficient, morally uncertain person who walked out alone into a broken country and did what needed doing without asking anyone's permission. The story found its most interesting protagonist and chose comfort over complexity. Screen Rant documented this directly, noting that Deku's vigilante arc ended almost as quickly as it began, that more time with that version of the character would have strengthened the story significantly, and that what was presented felt like a tease rather than a full exploration. The Dark Hero arc is remembered by a large portion of the fandom as the best stretch of Deku's personal story. It is also the shortest major arc in the series' final section. Those two facts are not unrelated. What makes this genuinely painful is how clearly it demonstrates what was possible. This is not a hypothetical about a different version of the series. This is the actual series, with the actual Deku briefly becoming something richer than it had been, and then choosing not to stay there. The potential was always in the material. Deku pushed past his limits, isolated from support, operating outside the system he was trained within. That combination produced something the story had never quite produced before. A protagonist who felt as complicated as the world he was living in. 6 episodes, then back to school. And the most troubling part is not that the arc ended. Every arc ends. The troubling part is that the story made a specific promise during those episodes. The same kind of promise the first chapter made about a quirkless boy becoming a hero, and did not see it through. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Which, when you think about it, is a pattern that runs all the way through this story. Promises made, promises not kept. And nowhere is that pattern more visible than in the one that sits at the very heart of what Deku's final arc was supposed to be about. Section 8. The Save the Villain promise that destroyed its own payoff. There is a specific kind of promise a story makes when it builds a hero whose defining quality is empathy. Not strength, not strategy, not the ability to hit hard enough or think fast enough. Empathy. The ability to look at a person that the rest of the world has written off and see, underneath all the damage and the destruction, the thing that made them human before everything went wrong. That kind of hero is rare in shonen manga. Most protagonists in this genre win by becoming stronger. Deku was positioned, across the middle and later portions of My Hero Academia, to win by reaching further. The villain he was supposed to reach was Tamura Shigaraki, and the story spent years, not episodes, years, building toward a moment where Deku would extend that reach and it would mean something. It built and built and built, and then, at the moment that mattered most, it pulled back. Not cleanly, not honestly. In the specific, unsatisfying way of a story that made a promise too large to keep and found a workaround that satisfied neither the people who wanted the promise kept nor the people who wanted it broken. Let us go back to where the promise starts. Shigaraki is introduced as the leader of the League of Villains. He is strange and twitchy and covered in disembodied hands, a detail that reads as creepy before it reads as tragic, which is intentional. He wants to destroy hero society. Not reform it, not fix it, destroy it completely, because in his experience, hero society is a lie that serves only the people
people it was designed to serve, and everyone else gets left in the dark. For several seasons, this is presented as straightforward villainy. He is the bad guy. His goals are destruction. He is Deku's opposite number. Then the story starts peeling back the layers. Shigaraki's real name is Tenko Shimura. He was a child who wanted to be a hero, specifically because of All Might, the same All Might that Deku idolizes. He grew up in a household where his father forbade any talk of heroes because his grandmother, Nana Shimura, had abandoned the family to become a hero, and his father never forgave her for it. Tenko could not talk about the thing he wanted most. He could not express the dream he carried. The pressure built. His quirk manifested during a family argument in the backyard. Decay, the ability to disintegrate anything he touches with all 5 fingers. It activated without warning or control. His dog died first, then his family, his father last. He was a child. He did not choose this. He stood in the ruins of his home with no understanding of what had happened and reached out for help. No hero came. All for One found him instead, shaped him, fed the grief and the rage and the confusion until they became something useful, built Shigaraki into a weapon piece by piece over years, while the boy who had wanted to be a hero was slowly replaced by something that had given up on the idea that heroism was real. This backstory does not make Shigaraki innocent. By the time the main story is happening, he has done genuinely terrible things. He has killed people. He has ordered attacks that hurt civilians. The decay of hero society is not an excuse for what he becomes, and the story is careful not to present it as one. But it is a history that explains how a child who reached out for help and received none became a person who stopped believing help was possible. Deku understands this. More than understands it, he feels it, because Deku is someone who was also told the world had no place for him. Someone who also reached out, in his own way, and initially found only closed doors. The difference between Deku and Shigaraki is not the origin. It is who found them, and what those people built in them. All Might found Deku. All for One found Tenko. The story makes this parallel so explicit that it is essentially spelled out on the page. And once it is spelled out, Deku's goal stops being simply to defeat Shigaraki. It becomes something more specific and more difficult. He wants to save him. Not the Shigaraki who kills and destroys, but the Tenko Shimura underneath, the child who was abandoned at the moment he needed someone most. Deku says this. He states it directly. He refuses to treat the fight as simply a fight. He is going to reach through everything Shigaraki has become and find the person who was there before. For this to work as a story, it requires one of 2 outcomes. Either Deku reaches Tenko and something real changes. The child is found, acknowledged, given the thing he was denied, and that act of reaching transforms the ending in a meaningful way. Or Deku tries and fails, and the failure costs him something, and the story is honest about the limits of empathy against damage this deep. Both are valid endings. Both are honest. Both would have meant something. What the story delivers is a third option that neither commits to nor avoids either of the first 2. In the final battle, Deku does reach Tenko. He enters something like a shared mental space, where the vestige of the child Tenko still exists inside the ruins of what Shigaraki became. He finds him. He speaks to him. Nana Shimura, Tenko's grandmother, one of the previous users of One for All, is there too, and she and her grandson have a moment of acknowledgement that had been denied them across multiple lifetimes. This sounds like resolution. In the moment, it reads as resolution, but then the actual outcome arrives. Shigaraki dies. His body disintegrates alongside All for One at the end of the final battle. He does not survive. There is no life after this for Tenko Shimura. No chance to exist in the world as someone who was reached, and who, having been reached, gets to find out what that means. The acknowledgement happens in a space that is already ending, and when it ends, he ends with it. Deku's last words to Shigaraki in that space are telling. He says he stopped Shigaraki because Shigaraki wanted to be stopped. He says he cannot forgive what was done, and he says that is exactly why he kept fighting. Not to punish, but because the fight was what Shigaraki needed in the end. There is genuine emotional weight in that exchange, but it sits alongside a fact the story cannot argue its way around. Deku spent multiple arcs refusing to kill Shigaraki. He stated this refusal explicitly. He made it the center of his approach to the entire final conflict. Not just beating the villain, but saving the person. And Shigaraki dies. The body is gone. Whatever saving happened in a mental space during the last moments of a battle, and it resulted in the exact outcome Deku said he was trying to prevent. He did not save Shigaraki. He reached Tenko briefly at the end of everything, and then Tenko was gone too. The story tries to frame this as a form of success, that Deku freed Tenko from All for One's hold in those final moments, that giving Shigaraki a death on his own terms, rather than as All for One's puppet, was itself a kind of saving. And there is something in that reading. It is not nothing. Shigaraki's last words, his instruction to tell Spinner that Tamura Shigaraki fought to destroy until the very end, have a dignity to them. He reclaims his own name and his own choices in the final seconds. But reclaiming your name while you are dying is not the same as being saved. And the audience
audience that spent seasons watching Deku refuse to give up on Shigaraki, that watched him insist again and again that the person underneath was worth reaching, that believed the story was building toward a payoff where that belief would be tested and proven. That audience did not get the scene they were promised. They got something adjacent to it, something that gestures at the promise while technically delivering a different outcome. The other layer that makes this harder is what the story reveals about Shigaraki in those final chapters. It turns out that All for One's manipulation of Tenko went further than anyone knew. He did not just find Tenko after the accident. He orchestrated the conditions that led to it. He was involved in the circumstances of Tenko's birth. Every major event in Shigaraki's life that turned him further toward destruction had All for One's fingerprints on it somewhere. This revelation is meant to reframe Shigaraki as even more of a victim than previously understood. But what it accidentally does is remove a significant part of his agency. If every choice that shaped him was manipulated, then Shigaraki as a character, as a person making decisions based on his own pain and his own conclusions, is undermined. He stops being someone who chose destruction after being abandoned and starts being someone who was guided toward destruction by a force that never gave him a real choice. That makes the story sadder. It also makes Deku's goal of saving him feel retroactively smaller. Because if Shigaraki was never truly free to become what he became, the act of reaching him does not require breaking through years of chosen bitterness. It requires breaking through a manipulation that was always going to crack once the manipulator was defeated. The promise was large. The delivery was complicated in ways that made it smaller than it was supposed to be. Deku's defining quality, the empathy that was supposed to be his real superpower, got its biggest test in the final arc.
And the result was a conclusion that left a significant portion of the audience unsatisfied in a way that went beyond just being sad about an outcome. It felt like a story that had prepared a door for years and then, at the moment of opening it, found a window instead. The Save the Villain promise was My Hero Academia at its most ambitious. Its resolution was My Hero Academia at its most cautious. And the space between those two things is where a lot of the series' legacy is still being worked out by the people who loved it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What makes that resolution even harder to sit with is what comes after. The epilogue, the rankings, the final image of who ended up where. Because the ending does not just leave the villain question unresolved. It quietly reveals something about the protagonist that the story spent years avoiding saying directly. Section 9, Number 4. The epilogue that accidentally indicts its own hero. Stories about becoming the best tend to end the same way. The underdog climbs, the training pays off, the final battle is won, and in the last few pages or the last few minutes, the world recognizes what the audience already knows. That this person, the one we followed from the very beginning, earned the top spot. Naruto becomes Hokage. Luffy becomes King of the Pirates. The promise made on page 1 gets honored on the last page, and the satisfaction of that completion is part of what makes the journey feel worth it. My Hero Academia opens with that same promise. The first chapter of the manga includes narration from an older version of Deku, looking back on his own life. He describes himself as a boy who had no power in a world full of it, and states plainly that this is the story of how he became the greatest hero. Not one of the greatest, not a great hero, the greatest. That is the specific word the story uses in the first chapter, in the protagonist's own voice, about his own future. By the end of the series, Deku is ranked number 4. That is the fact, confirmed in the My Hero Academia Ultra Age fanbook, which Horikoshi produced after the manga ended, and which contains the official post-story hero rankings. 8 years after the final war, the official hierarchy of professional heroes in Japan looks like this. Mirio Togata, known as Lemillion, is number 1. Shoto Todoroki is number 2. Mount Lady is number 3. Izuku Midoriya, the boy whose story this was, is number 4. Katsuki Bakugo is number 5. Read that list once and keep reading. Then read it again. The protagonist, who the story opened by promising would become the greatest hero, ended his journey ranked below the person who should have been the protagonist, below his classmate, below a hero who had almost no focus during the main story, and one position above the person who told him to go kill himself in chapter 1. That is not a triumphant ending for a story about becoming the best. That is a story that made a specific promise on page 1 and delivered something meaningfully different on the last page, while hoping the emotional weight of the journey would make make you not notice the gap. Some people did not notice. Some people felt the ending was beautiful regardless, that the rankings did not matter, that what Deku became was more important than any number on a chart. That reading is available, and it is not wrong. But it sits alongside a structural fact that the story cannot argue away. Deku said he would be the greatest. He was not. And the story that built him never addresses this directly or honestly. Look at what the rankings actually say about the characters involved. Mirio Togata at number 1 is the clearest possible statement the epilogue makes about what My Hero Academia actually believed. After everything, after Night Eye's original recommendation, after the overhaul arc, after Horikoshi's own stated regret about not doing Mirio justice, after the offer Deku made him that he declined, the story ends with Mirio at the top. The person who should have been the protagonist, by almost every measure the story itself establishes, ends up in the position the protagonist was promised. The story does not comment on this. It presents it as straightforwardly good news, a happy ending for a beloved character. But it is impossible to look at that number 1 next to Mirio's name and not feel the weight of everything discussed in the sections before this one. Every argument about why the wrong person got the quirk, every comparison between Deku's borrowed strength and Mirio's earned mastery, every moment where the show quietly confirmed that its own supporting character was more suited to the protagonist role. All of it lands differently when you see the final chart. Mirio ends at number 1. That is where the story's actual thesis about heroism points. Now look at number 5. Bakugo at number 5 is the epilogue's other quietly devastating detail. This is the character who told Deku to go jump off the roof. This is the person who physically intimidated him for years, took his notebooks and threw them in water, made Deku's name into a weapon, and spent a significant portion of the series treating the protagonist as something beneath contempt. His apology in Season 6 was genuine. His growth across the series was real, but he is number 5 on the professional hero rankings, and Deku is number 4, and the distance between them is a single position. The story probably intends this as a clean resolution. Deku ahead, Bakugo behind, the natural order preserved, the journey validated. What it actually looks like, once you see it clearly, is the story handing Deku a one-position lead over the person who abused him and calling it justice. A margin of 1 ranking point between a victim and the person who victimized him is not a ringing statement about the power of determination over cruelty. It is barely a distinction at all. There is also the matter of what the rankings represent and what they leave out. Hero rankings in My Hero Academia are not just about power. They are not just about how many fights you win or how many villains you stop. They reflect public perception, the number of people helped, the breadth of impact a hero has on society. Bakugo's ranking at number 5, despite being confirmed by the Ultra Age fanbook to be one of the physically strongest heroes in the series, arguably stronger than everyone above him on the chart, is explicitly linked to his personality. He is still aggressive. He still makes people around him uncomfortable. His power is undeniable, but his presence is hard to trust. Deku at number 4 has none of those social problems. He is genuinely beloved. He saved the world. He sacrificed his power in the final battle. He should, by almost every measure the story uses to evaluate heroism, be higher. The fact that he is not, that he peaks at 4th despite being the central figure of the entire story, is something the epilogue never explains and never addresses. The story just presents the chart and moves on. It is worth noting what the rankings do not include. Deku, by the time the epilogue takes place, is quirkless again. The ember of one for all that remained in him after the final battle faded over the course of the 8-year time skip. He is a hero who operates without a quirk, using support equipment built for him by people who love him, a suit that gives him capabilities in the field, designed by his allies, handed to him as a going-away present from the people who wanted him to keep going. So the number 4 ranking represents a quirkless Deku, using borrowed technology to compete with quirk users in a world that was built for quirk users, in isolation, that could be framed as the story finally delivering on its original premise. The quirkless kid making it work after all, but the timing is wrong. The premise was supposed to be proven during the story, with the stakes at their highest, when it would have cost something and meant something. Proving it in the epilogue, 8 years after everything is already over, when the danger has passed and the world is rebuilding and nobody is threatening his position. That is the story finding the safest possible moment to make the argument it was supposed to make at its most vulnerable. There is one more detail in the epilogue that almost nobody talks about, and it matters. Deku becomes a teacher at UA High School. This is presented as a beautiful full-circle ending. He started at UA as a student. He ends at UA as a teacher. He gets to be in the building that shaped him, now shaping the next generation. In the final pages of the manga, he meets a young student who has just tried to save someone and failed, and that student asks him, the way Deku once asked All Might, whether someone like them could become a hero too, and Deku reaches out to them the way All Might once reached out to him. It is a genuinely moving image. As an emotional emotional beat, it works. But look at what it means structurally. Deku becomes a teacher at the institution that watched Bakugo bully him and did nothing. He works within the system that failed him as a student. He does not reform it from outside or challenge it from within, or use his position to make it into something better than what it was. He steps into the role of the adults who were not there for him and tries to do it better on a personal level, one student at a time. That is admirable. It is also small. For a story that built itself on the idea that hero society was broken and needed to change, the protagonist's final contribution to that change is teaching classes at the school where the story began.
The structural problems, the quirkless discrimination, the pressure on children to be heroes, the gap between the public face of heroism and the reality behind it are still there. Deku's presence at UA does not address them. It works around them. The epilogue of My Hero Academia is the story settling, not triumphantly, but quietly, taking the pieces of its protagonist and arranging them into something that looks like resolution from a distance, and hoping that the emotional warmth of the final images carries more weight than the specific details of what those images actually say. Number 4. 1 above the bully, 3 below the person who deserved the spot. Teaching at the school that failed him. Operating without the quirk he spent the whole story mastering. Working in the system he was supposed to prove wrong. That is where the story left its protagonist. And it says more about the story's relationship with Deku than any of the promotional materials or any of the fight sequences or any of the emotional climaxes across the full run. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But even the epilogue is not the final word on why Deku was a mistake as a protagonist choice. Because underneath every structural problem, beneath every broken promise and every loop and every missed opportunity, there is one fundamental truth about this character that the ending accidentally confirms. It is the quiet thing the story was dancing around from chapter 1, and it connects directly to the biggest question the series ever asked. Not about power or heroism or society, but about what this story was actually for. Section 10. The ending confirmed what the beginning implied. Deku never had a story, he had a vessel. There is a question that sits underneath everything this essay has been building toward. Not whether Deku is a good character, not whether My Hero Academia is a good series. Both of those questions have answers that reasonable people can debate and reach different conclusions on. The question underneath all of it is simpler and stranger and more unsettling than either of those. What was My Hero Academia actually about? Not what it said it was about. Not the marketing, not the opening narration, not the stated goals of the protagonist. What did the story, across 430 chapters, actually spend its time on? What question was it genuinely trying to answer? And when you find that question, the real one, the one the story was working toward without always knowing it, does Deku fit it? In 2025, at an exhibition celebrating My Hero Academia, Kohei Horikoshi sat down and answered questions about the series. He was asked a specific question about the ending, about why the story finished the way it did, rather than the way Chapter 1 seemed to promise. The original narration said Deku would become the greatest hero. He did not, in any straightforward sense, become that. So what happened? Horikoshi's answer was honest in a way that is worth sitting with carefully. He said he originally planned for the story to end with Deku becoming a teacher and saying the words, "You can be a hero," to a new student. He said the ending changed because somewhere across the run of the series, the story stopped being only about Deku and One for All. It became, in his own words, an exploration of the question of what it actually means to be the greatest hero. And the answer that the manga arrived at was this: being the greatest hero means reaching a hand out to others. So the final chapter was written around that answer rather than around Deku's individual journey. Read that again slowly. The story's own creator is saying that his ending changed because the question the story was asking outgrew the character the story was supposedly about. The exploration of what heroism really means became bigger than Izuku Midoriya. And when those two things pulled in different directions, Horikoshi followed the question and let the character's individual story dissolve into the answer. That is not a small admission. That is the author of My Hero Academia confirming, in careful and thoughtful language, that his protagonist was not big enough for his own story. Deku was a vessel. The question was the thing that mattered. Deku carried the question from chapter 1 to chapter 430, and when the question found its answer, Deku stepped aside and let the answer be bigger than him. In a different kind of story, a protagonist being smaller than their own theme would be a tragedy worth exploring. The person who carries the weight without getting to be the answer, there is something genuinely moving in that, if the story acknowledges it honestly. But My Hero Academia does not frame it that way. It presents Deku's ending as a happy resolution. He is a teacher. He is reaching out to young students. He found his place. The emotional register of the final chapters asks you to feel satisfied, and many people do feel satisfied. The ending is warm, and it is not dishonest about the warmth. But warmth and completeness are different things. A story can feel warm while leaving something unresolved, and what is unresolved
involved in My Hero Academia's ending is the specific promise the first chapter made to the specific person the story was supposedly about. Deku said he would be the greatest hero. The story decided somewhere in the middle that greatness meant something different from what Chapter 1 implied. Not rankings, not power, not being the strongest, but reaching out. And Deku does reach out. He reaches out constantly, across the whole run, and it is genuine. But the redefining of greatness that the story performs feels, if you are watching it honestly, like the story moving the target because the character could not hit the original one. The greatest hero in Japan, by the story's ending, is Mirio Togata. If the new definition of greatness is reaching out to others, Mirio reaches out too, warmly, consistently, with a presence that makes people feel safe in a way Deku's more anxious and intense presence never quite manages. If the new definition of greatness is inspiring the next generation, Mirio's graduation speech in the epilogue does exactly that. If the new definition of greatness is sacrifice, Mirio sacrificed his quirk to protect a child and kept fighting without it. Whatever definition of greatest hero the story lands on, Mirio fits it at least as well as Deku, and in several cases better. The redefinition does not actually solve the problem it was trying to solve. It just moves it slightly to the left. Now here is the part that connects everything this essay has traced across 9 sections. The broken premise in section 1, the quirkless boy who was given the strongest quirk, exists because the story needed a vessel strong enough to carry the question to the end. Keeping Deku quirkless would have been thematically braver, but narratively harder to sustain across the length and scale the story eventually reached. So the vessel got the power it needed to make the journey. The Mirio problem in section 2, the better candidate standing right there passed over, exists because the vessel was chosen by feeling rather than design. The story needed someone to carry the question, and All Might chose the person who was standing in front of him. Mirio would have been the more coherent choice, but the story was not optimizing for coherence. It was following a moment. The thematic contradiction in section 3, the premise proving society right, exists because the vessel's function required it to operate within the system rather than challenge it. A quirkless protagonist challenging the system from outside would have been a different kind of story, one where the vessel itself was the argument. But this story needed its vessel inside the system, climbing through it, so the challenge to the system had to remain largely theoretical. The Aesop amnesia in section 4, the lesson learned and unlearned on a loop, exists because a vessel does not need to permanently change in the way a protagonist does. A vessel needs to keep moving forward. The lesson about asking for help resets because the story needed Deku to keep facing the same kind of crisis, keep being pulled back by the people around him, keep demonstrating that the community was the answer. A vessel that permanently learned the lesson would stop needing to be saved, and being saved by the people around him is part of what Deku does for the story. It keeps demonstrating the value of connection. The bullying arc in section 5, the harm that the story placed on the victim to resolve, exists because the vessel's goodness needed to be consistently demonstrated, and there is no cleaner demonstration of goodness than absorbing damage and responding with generosity. Deku's reaction to Bakugo's bullying is not just character detail. It is the story using its vessel to make an argument about what kind of person is worth following. The problem is that the argument asks too much of the character and too little of the world around him. The support cast running laps in section 6, everyone else being more interesting, exists because the vessel is designed to reflect rather than contain. Deku is most useful to the story when he is making other people's stories possible. The sports festival section, the overhaul arc, the final war. In each of these, Deku's presence enables something in someone else that would not have happened without him. He is the stone that creates ripples. The ripples are where the life is. The dark Deku arc in section 7, the most interesting version abandoned, exists because a vessel that goes fully dark stops being a vessel. The story needed Deku broken enough to be compelling, but functional enough to complete the journey. 6 episodes of genuine complexity, and then a return to the usable version. The dark arc was a pressure valve, not a transformation. The save the villain promise in section 8, made and not kept, exists because the story's question about heroism required the attempt, even if the outcome could not deliver on the full promise. Deku reaching toward Shigaraki was the story asking its question at maximum volume. Shigaraki dying anyway was the story being honest that not every reach lands, but being dishonest about what it had told the audience to expect from this particular reach. And the epilogue in section 9, number 4, teacher at UA, quirkless with a borrowed suit, is the story placing its vessel in storage after the journey is complete. The question has been answered. The vessel has served its purpose. Now it gets a warm and gentle resting place that asks you to feel the warmth rather than examine the rest. All of it connects. All of it points toward the same quiet truth. My Hero Academia is an extraordinary piece of work. The world it builds is genuinely rich. The villains, particularly Shigaraki and Hawks and Twice, are among the most emotionally extremely precise characters in shonen history. The themes it reaches for, even the ones it does not fully grasp, are worth reaching for. The question it asks about heroism, what does it actually mean? Who does it actually serve? What does it cost the people who practice it and the people who need it, is a real and important question. The mistake was making Deku the center of it. Not because Deku is badly written, not because the character is without value or without moments of genuine resonance. The mistake is more specific than that. Deku was designed to ask the question rather than to be the answer. He was built to be the lens through which the world and the people in it could be examined. That function is valuable, but it is not the same as being a protagonist. And across 430 chapters, the tension between those two things, between Deku as lens and Deku as protagonist, never fully resolved. The story kept trying to make the lens into the answer, kept arranging the final images so that Deku stood at the center of the resolution. But the answer the story actually found, the real one, the one Horikoshi articulated in that 2025 interview, belongs to everyone. It belongs to Mirio catching people who fall. It belongs to Uraraka reaching out to Toga. It belongs to Bakugo learning to fight alongside rather than above. It belongs to every person in that story who found a way to extend a hand towards someone the world had decided was not worth reaching. Deku does this too. He does it well. He does it consistently. But he does not do it uniquely. And in a story where the answer turned out to be collective, the choice to center one vessel was always going to leave something incomplete. The greatest hero in the story, by the story's own final definition, is the one who reaches furthest and most honestly, and at the greatest personal cost. By that measure, Mirio Togata, who lost everything on a hallway floor protecting a child and kept going, has a reasonable claim to the title. By that measure, Bakugo charging in front of a lethal attack to protect Deku in the final battle has a reasonable claim. By that measure, even Shigaraki, who in his last moments reclaimed his own name and sent a message of solidarity to the person who believed in him, has something. Deku has the reaching. He has always had the reaching, but the story gave everything else to other people and left him with the gesture. The boy who was supposed to become the greatest hero became instead the person the greatest story was carried by. That is not nothing. In the long view of things, being the vessel for a story this large and this ambitious is its own kind of significance, but it is not what Chapter 1 promised. It is not what the narration said.
It is not what the boy crying in front of the television screen at 4 years old was dreaming of when he clenched his fists and decided that he was going to be a hero no matter what the world said. He wanted to be the answer. The story made him the question, and those are not the same thing. They were never the same thing. And the gap between them, the specific, quiet, persistent gap between what Deku was promised and what Deku became, is exactly the size and shape of the mistake this story made on roughly page 50, when it gave a quirkless boy the strongest power in existence and called it the beginning of a hero's journey. It was, just not the journey that mattered most. That journey belonged to everyone else. And the best parts of My Hero Academia, the parts that will stay with people for a long time, were always in the everyone else. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.